Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hello, Mouin. Thank you for joining us again.
Hi, Nasim. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
It's a pleasure, likewise. We will start off with the horrific images that's coming out of Rafah. Israel targeted a UN-run safe zone, killing dozens of Palestinians, stories of decapitated babies, burning tents. So it's really shocking images. So we'll speak to Moin about that. And then the implications of Hamas capturing Israeli soldiers in northern Gaza, where there has been continuing fighting between Hamas and Israeli forces. There's claims and counterclaims about that. We'll discuss that as well. Fallout from last week's ICJ and ICC judgment. There's been lots said since, and we'll be reviewing some of that. And one of the consequences of that is Israel's weaponization of tax revenues against Palestinians in response to three European states recognizing a Palestinian state. And we'll be reflecting on President Biden's floating pier being washed away by waves. So is this a metaphor for something more than simply a pier being washed away? We'll get Moin's thoughts on that. But Moin, if we can begin with some breaking news, there's nothing confirmed at the moment, but there is breaking news that Egyptian soldiers and Israeli soldiers exchanged fire. Can you say more about that? And I know details are vague at the moment, but I think it's worth us responding to this because it is such a huge development if it is the case.
Well, as you said, there's a lot we don't know. The available reports state that one Egyptian soldier was killed by Israeli fire, and a number of others wounded. The Israelis have been insisting that they were responding to Egyptian forces, which opened fire first. This incident took place on the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And the background is, of course, that as part of its offensive into the Rafah region, the Israeli military has been seizing control of that border zone, what it calls the Philadelphia Corridor. And in doing so, it has violated a core aspect of the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which limits the forces Israel can place on its side of the border, that it's the so-called Area D, both in numbers and materiel, and Israel has far exceeded that. What would be interesting to learn, if we end up learning anything at all, is whether Egyptian forces opened fire in an organized manner because, for example, the Israeli forces crossed the border into Egyptian territory, whether this was an individual soldier who took the initiative without having orders to confront the Israeli military. But it's clearly a serious incident. As you noted, it's breaking news, and we'll have to wait to learn more.
Yeah, it is a worrying development. I mean, the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, Camp David Accords, is often described as a soft peace. I don't think it's one of those peace treaties which is popular with Egyptians or with Arab countries. So we'll see how that develops. It's been one of the foundational pillars of Israel's safety in the Middle East. And if that was to be threatened in any way, of course, that will have huge implications. And we will follow that story. And next week, we may have something more to speak about. But let's turn our attention to what's been happening in Rafah in Gaza, especially overnight. We've seen shocking images of beheaded babies. Palestinians don't seem to have anywhere left to escape. You know, their mosques, their schools, their hospitals, churches, everything has been destroyed. Now it seems Israel is dropping 2,000-pound bombs on UN tents and shelters, and that's quite a shocking development. What's your thoughts on the events of last night?
Yes, shocking and horrific development, but unfortunately, hardly unique in terms of what we have been seeing in the Gaza Strip during the past 8 months. I think the immediate background to this is the recent ruling by the International Court of Justice in The Hague in response to a further appeal from South Africa, in which the ICJ judges, by a majority of 13-2, ordered Israel to immediately halt its offensive into Rafah. The United States basically pretended nothing happened. It hasn't yet commented on this. And I think that gave Israel the assurance that it had a green light to continue. And I think it's also interesting that the weaponry used by Israel, these 2,000-pound bombs you mentioned, are precisely the munitions that US President Joe Biden, in a recent interview with CNN, claimed that he was holding up the delivery of them to Israel precisely because he did not want them used in Rafah. This was one more rhetorical effort by Biden to lay out a red line for Israel. And as soon as Israel crossed it, Biden and his spokespersons shifted the goalposts. This area that Israel hit was, as you said, a tent encampment that had been designated as a safe zone, right next to a logistics depot established by UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Agency for Palestinians. And basically people were incinerated, burned alive, beheaded babies, absolutely horrific scenes. And, this is Israel's way of demonstrating to the court, not only to the international community, but also to its Western backers, we will do as we please. There's nothing you can do to stop us. And the reason there's nothing you can do to stop us is because we have the ironclad protection of the United States, which agrees with us that Palestinians are subhuman, that they're irrelevant, expendable human scum, and we can kill them in any way we want, as many as we want, and nothing will happen. Now you look at the responses, there has been widespread condemnation, but I think 8 months into a genocide, verbal condemnation is meaningless when it is not accompanied by concrete action. And thus far, there has been no concrete action, whether from Arab states that have issued condemnation, European states, or indeed any others, with the exception of South Africa. There is one more response that I found interesting, and that was a response of Israel itself. In the wake of what Israelis are describing or had been warning as a diplomatic tsunami, which now appears to be gathering pace in the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, European states recognizing Palestinian statehood, and so on. Netanyahu described this horrific attack as a tragic accident. And, you can kind of dismiss that, but it's a change of tone from either celebrating these attacks or from laying the blame exclusively at the feet of Palestinians, or making bogus claims that it was a errant Palestinian missile or what have you. So even though Israel is maintaining that it was targeting Hamas commanders who were in this encampment, kind of a routine propaganda response in such circumstances, it also went out of its way to indicate that it views this as a tragic accident that it will be investigating. Now you look at, hundreds of similar attacks Israel has conducted during the past 8 months. It hasn't even bothered to, more often than not, hasn't even bothered to provide a pretext or a rationale, or to describe it as tragic and to say it is investigating. Another response was from the United Nations so-called peace coordinator in Jerusalem, a Norwegian diplomat, Tor Wennesland. On the one hand, he strongly condemned the attack, but then he called on the Israeli military to conduct a thorough investigation to get to the truth and to hold those responsible accountable. Um, Anyone who is even remotely familiar with Israel's investigation processes, if they wanted any accountability at all, would never suggest that such an investigation needs to be conducted by the Israelis themselves. The purpose of Israeli investigations is basically to whitewash Israeli crimes. And typically the Israelis will announce they're conducting an investigation. Usually they don't, and then nothing happens. And if a year later a journalist asks about it, we'll get back to you. But I mean, for someone of Tor Veneslan's knowledge to even suggest that Israel, rather than any independent international or UN body, should be in charge of such an investigation is, I think, to say the very least, profoundly disappointing.
Yeah, we'll be picking up on many of the themes you mentioned in your answer later on. But if we can stick to Gaza in the next couple of minutes, just to discuss some of the fighting that's taking place in northern Gaza between Israeli soldiers and Hamas fighters. Hamas has said that it has captured Israeli soldiers. Israel has denied that. How much of a setback, should it be the case that they have actually captured, which there's footage of it, how much of a setback would the capture of Israeli soldiers be for Israel, given that northern Gaza has allegedly been cleared many, many months ago? How much of a setback would that be?
Well, I think if these reports are confirmed, it would be hugely significant on a number of levels. First of all, the Israelis, as you mentioned, have claimed not once but repeatedly that they have effectively eliminated Hamas from the northern Gaza Strip, including from Jabalia and the Jabalia refugee camp. What Hamas is asserting, and there's some video evidence that appears to confirm it, though I think we do need to keep an open mind until there is definitive confirmation, was that it lured an Israeli elite unit into a tunnel and managed to kill, wound, or capture all of its members, and to do the same for a backup unit that then came in to rescue them. So first of all, it means that Hamas, the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, remains a coherent and effective fighting force in the northern Gaza Strip. Secondly, it sends a clear message to Israel that you are using the campaign to retrieve your captives and hostages as one of your main rationales for continuing this campaign. But what is happening in practice is that you're not only losing more dead and wounded, but the number of captives are increasing. So I think this needs to be seen not just at the military level, but also at the political and psychological level. And I think we should see this also in combination with the recent missile attack from the southern Gaza Strip onto the greater Tel Aviv area. Militarily, of course, as with previous such attacks, it's not of particular significance. It causes some disruption. In this case, I think 4 Israelis were reported wounded. But again, it sends a strong political and psychological message. Almost a year into this war, in which Israel has been declaring one victory after another, and in which Israel is claiming it needs to go into Rafah to administer a final and definitive and comprehensive defeat on Hamas. Not only is Hamas still conducting what would appear to be complex military operations in the northern Gaza Strip, but it's still capable of hitting the Tel Aviv region from the southern Gaza Strip.
I mean, Israel seems to be way past borrowed times. It's moved way beyond that, and you get a sense of that from the way a number of countries have reacted into the ICJ and ICC judgment last week. We mentioned that the attack last night follows the ICJ ruling calling on Israel to stop its attack on Rafah, to immediately halt that. In response to that, a number of European countries, EU's chief foreign policy advisor, Joseph Borrell, he said that everybody agrees that the rulings of the ICJ are binding and they have to be implemented. And what surprised me, certainly, is also the response of Germany to the ICC judgment. Germany said that if arrest warrants are issued, then Germany would step in to basically arrest Yoav Gallant and Netanyahu. So that, to me, was a shocking development. So do you believe that there's been a huge shift? To me, as I said, that Israel's living on borrowed times, is moved past that now. And yesterday's attack on Rafah with the decapitated babies, which was meant to be a red line for Americans and the Brits, who haven't really said much, but definitely the EU and Germany seemed to have moved on their position.
I think these are significant developments. I wouldn't want to exaggerate their significance, because when 8 months into a genocidal campaign, you finally begin hearing some people in Europe make some statements that appear somewhat rational. On the one hand, let's not give them too much credit for finally beginning to see a little bit of the light. But at the same time, words need to be met with action, and we have seen absolutely nothing at that level yet. What I thought was interesting about Borrell's response, in addition to what you said, he also stated explicitly that we will now have to choose between our support for international law and the international institutions that uphold international law. We will have to choose between those on the one hand and our support for Israel on the other hand. In other words, support for Israel and support for international law are two fundamentally incompatible policies. And as you mentioned, I think the response of European governments is particularly relevant here, because unlike the United States, these are all state parties to the International Criminal Court. These are countries that have all ratified, unlike Israel and the United States, but along with the Palestinians, these are all countries that have ratified the Rome Statute. These are all countries that have celebrated all the previous arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court, most prominently in the case of Russian President Vladimir Putin, but also the various arrest warrants and trials conducted of African warlords and so on. So I think if these governments were now to come out and be entirely dismissive of the ICC prosecutors' applications for arrest warrants of Israeli leaders, not only would it make a complete mockery of their supposed support for these institutions and international law, but it really would be the final coffin in the final nail, rather, in the coffin of their rules-based international order. A situation that would be simply untenable. Maybe when Israel is quietly expanding settlements in the West Bank, with a few houses here, a few trailers there, they could look the other way and pretend nothing is happening. But in this situation, to be dismissive, to parrot U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and say the case is meritless and so on, was simply not a tenable proposition for them.
And I've been watching closely the fallout from the ICC judgment last week. And some of it's just really unbelievable. I mean, what so many US politicians and lawmakers in Congress, they kept on focusing on this idea of moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel. It seems like they were taking their lines from an Israeli playbook. It seems quite obvious. Another thing that struck me is how quickly Israel released videos and footage claiming or supporting their narrative that Palestinian or Hamas fighters had committed genocide. And one of those was a video of female Israeli soldiers, and it was clearly doctored. It was clearly a mistranslation of what was happening, and it was being shared by a number of Israeli influencers and billionaires in the US who support Israel. And this is a doctored video pushing the rape narrative. And it came out immediately after the ICC issued its judgment. And I found that such an obvious attempt to obfuscate and derail the ICC story. That was one of my observations. And what did you see that was quite note that was
Yes.
interesting in the week since the ICC issued its judgment?
Yes, this mass rape narrative that people who have closely examined it are increasingly characterizing as the mass rape hoax is the gift that keeps on giving to Israeli Hasbara, to Israeli propaganda. And I think the first question one has to ask is, if the facts are so well established, why does Israel time after time after time need to engage in this kind of fraudulent practice of deliberately mistranslating statements, or in addition to the incident you mentioned, displaying a Palestinian father and son in Israeli custody, speaking in front of an Israeli flag, confessing how they jointly, together with a number of other relatives, raped women on October 7th. It's simply not credible. I think Israel really has gotten to the point of being unable to preach to other than the converted. And this story, it comes out on the eve of every major international legal development. New life is breathed into it. It was again resuscitated just as Israeli forces were going into at Shifa Hospital and so on. And I suspect most people are beginning to see through this. Not only, is it constantly revived and resuscitated, but increasingly fraudulent means to promote it. In this case, completely deliberately mistranslating things to give it a substance that it otherwise doesn't have. But beyond that, what if everything that the Israelis are claiming is true? What if the truth is even worse than what the Israelis are claiming? How does that in any way justify or explain or give any legitimacy to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide, for which there can be no defense? If you're committing indefensible crimes, then there is nothing that has been done to you that can justify your conduct. And I think, I think that's what people around the world are increasingly concluding, that Israel, which is addicted to playing the victim, it's this unique combination of the victim aggressor, seems to think that if they can persuade enough people that Palestinians are some kind of diabolical, evil, subhuman force, that then they can do as they please and burn people alive in their tents and decapitate Palestinian babies and systematically destroy hospitals and all the rest of it. And it's Israel's problem is it's not working anymore.
Yeah, and I think that the assumption from the Israeli side is that the level of indoctrination Israelis go through and radicalization which causes or leads them to believe that Palestinians are barbarians, Muslims and Arabs are barbarians, is something that happens across the world, and it's not the case.
Well,
People
how do
haven't.
you dehumanize a child burnt to a crisp by an American bomb dropped by an Israeli airplane? How do you dehumanize entire families incinerated in their tents in an area designated by Israel itself as a safe zone? It might work very well in Tel Aviv, but it's not working in Johannesburg. It's not working in Amman. It's not working in London, and it's not even working in large parts of the United States anymore.
Hmm. And what was interesting is who didn't share the rape hoax story, and clearly people are not willing to believe in the Israeli propaganda and the lies because it was so obviously exposed by many experts on social media, and that was a positive sign for me that this rape hoax story did not um, grab the attention of people who otherwise before 7 October or at the early stages would have believed it. But I think more and more people are realizing that, they're just being used as tools to peddle Israeli lies, and that realization is growing even more.
I
Um,
would, I would, sorry, I would just like to make a clarification here about what the rape hoax story does and does not entail. Um, Whether or not there was any sexual violence on the 7th of October is one question. And that does need to be properly investigated and so on. But that is not the Israeli claim. The Israeli claim is
mm,
not that there were specific individual cases of sexual violence on the 7th of October. Israel is claiming that is claim is that there was a mass organized, premeditated, systematic campaign of rape and other forms of sexual violence against Israeli women on the 7th of October. That's the hoax. And here I find it interesting that if you look at the application submitted by ICC prosecutor Karim Khan for warrants of arrest for the three Hamas leaders, the sexual violence that he claims to have evidence for concerns sexual violence against women who are in captivity in the Gaza Strip after 7th of October, not for any incidents or campaign within Israel on the 7th of October. And I found it telling that given the amount of attention that he has devoted to this question, that he doesn't have the confidence to seek arrest warrants for that himself.
mm. Another story I think that deserves our attention is the performance of Karim Khan himself since he requested the issuance of arrest warrants last week. And one thing that grabbed my attention is his interview with CNN, where he said that and a Western official told him that the court is meant to be used for Africans and thugs like Putin only, and not for our Western allies. So Karim Khan seems to, have pushed back against that, and he wants to change the image of the ICC. I mean, ICC throughout its history has issued arrest warrants against 47 out of 50 individuals that were tried, all African. 47 out of the 50 are all African. So I think, do you think Karim Khan generally wants to change the image of the ICC as being a weapon that's used against African leaders? And can he be successful? I mean, he surprised many by even applying for this arrest warrant and taking on the Israelis and his Western backers. Well, I would say backers because they supported him. Khan was supported by the Israelis and the Brits and the Americans, but he has decided to issue this arrest warrant. So have you been surprised, and do you think he can succeed in undermining, or not undermining, but by breaking away from the history of the ICC, constantly attacking or charging African leaders?
Well, this exchange related by Khan demonstrates that those who were characterizing the ICC as, for example, the International Criminal Court for Africa or the International Caucasian Court, have been right all along. Secondly, yes, Karim Khan did finally bite the bullet and issue applications for the arrest of two Israeli leaders. But let's not give him too much credit. I think he was painted into a corner. I think he acted only because he felt he had no choice but to do otherwise. He was in a position where there was a growing international clamor for him to act. He was put in a situation where the principles that he said would govern his tenure were completely shorn of any legitimacy based on previous actions he had taken, and the hypocrisy became too much to bear. And he was put in a position where he was being constantly pilloried, even by his own peers. So I don't think Khan acted out of a genuine desire to enhance the legitimacy of the ICC, the legitimacy, I should add, which he had done a lot to demolish during the first 2 years of his tenure. He acted because he was left with no choice. Now, I think an argument can be made that he chose to issue these applications for the arrest warrants of Israeli and Palestinian leaders simultaneously because he wanted to avoid the impression of singling out either one or the other, even though the arrest warrants would be for quite different crimes. But having said that, he is still playing politics. The investigation that he is in charge of goes back to 2014. So why does history for Karim Khan begin on October 7th? Why has he ignored apartheid, settlement, and a variety of other crimes that took place between June of 2014 and the 7th of October 2023, which he has supposedly been investigating for a much longer time than he has been investigating events during the last 8 months? It just doesn't add up unless you take the view that Karim Khan was determined to take his first actions on this file in a way that made Palestinians not only as culpable as Israelis, but judging by his initial step of issuing 3 applications for the arrest of Palestinians and only 2 for the arrest of Israelis, to make them seem more culpable. So there are many, many questions about Karim Khan's conduct in office, very few of which reflect positively on him. But having said that, I think we should take satisfaction that he was finally forced to take action, not only to defend his office, but to defend the very legitimacy of the court. And in doing so, took steps that, as we have been discussing, are not only legally, but also politically of enormous importance.
Another thing that's become clear, well, clear to me anyway, is how the Israelis take out their anger and frustration on the Palestinians. The ICJ issues a ruling on Friday, and over the weekend, Israel attacks Rafah in the most horrific way. And similarly, last week, 3 European countries said they would recognize Palestine. We spoke about that in our last show: Spain, Ireland, and Norway. And what did Israel do? It reacted by, again, punishing Palestinians by cutting off tax revenue, which goes to the Palestinians. So speak to that, and what is the, where does this tax system that's been used and weaponized constantly against the Palestinians. Where does the fault lie in that tax system, and why Israel constantly punishes Palestinians for its diplomatic failures to win over the West on this issue?
Well, what Israel did is first its finance minister took in his view, the retaliatory measure of ceasing the monthly transfer of Palestinian tax receipts to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. To make a long story short, in 1994, at the beginning of the Oslo process, Israel and the PLO signed the so-called Paris Protocol, in which Israel was able to achieve its main demand of maintaining the enforced common market between Israel and the occupied territories. And the Palestinians agreed that import duties, taxes, and so on that are meant to accrue to the Palestinian Authority would be collected by Israel on its behalf. And the Israelis agreed that all the monies that they collected on behalf of the Palestinian Authority, which are Palestinian and not Israeli funds, would be transferred in full minus a administrative fee to the Palestinian Authority on a monthly basis. It didn't take long for the Israelis to begin using this arrangement as a political weapon and withholding the transfer of, again, what are Palestinian tax receipts and customs duties and so on, to refuse to transfer them to the Palestinian Authority in order to exercise political pressure on the Palestinians. So that's the fundamental problem. Many people believe the Palestinians should have never agreed to this arrangement to begin with. But just as important, Israel has been repeatedly using this arrangement as a method of political pressure. That's the first retaliatory measure, if you will. And as you mentioned, Israel has a problem with someone more powerful. It takes it out on a weaker party, in this case, the Palestinians. Secondly, the Israeli foreign minister stated that he would prohibit the Spanish consulate in Jerusalem from providing any consular services to Palestinian residents of the occupied territories. I mean, imagine, that the brazenness of informing a foreign consulate who it may and who it may not provide consular services to. And then the Israeli foreign minister went one step further and reminded Spain of its horrible experience of living under jihadi Islamic rule for several hundred years in Al-Andalus, displaying an extraordinary ignorance of not only general history and Iberian history, but even of Jewish history, because it was under the so-called jihadi Muslim rule that Iberian Jews experienced what they refer to as their golden age. And it was after the fall of this so-called jihadi Muslim rule in Spain at the end of the 15th century that the Iberian Jews, known as Sephardim, were forced to convert and then collectively expelled. Where did they go? Well, some went to Holland, some went to other places, but most ended up choosing to live under another so-called jihadi Islamic entity, namely the Ottoman Empire. So, this kind of knee-jerk Islamophobia, which Israel and its apologists have been doing so much to promote and to fund and to spread, particularly since 9/11, makes a reappearance here in the context of a diplomatic spat between Israel and Spain. And why? Because Spain recognized that Palestinians have rights.
I've always believed that Zionism requires a complete fabrication of Jewish and Muslim relationships in history. And it needed to vilify Muslims and present Jewish presence in the Middle East as being one of constant oppression and facing existential threats, which is, of course, not the case. Muslim leaders throughout history. I mean, I did a debunk video about this, just showing how Muslims throughout history have saved Jews and maintained their presence in Palestine when it was Christians, well, some Christians who expelled them. And one of the arguments I think you could make is that it's because of Muslims behaving or acting in the interest of Jews that you have centuries of continuous Jewish existence in Palestine, which Zionists now use and say, oh, we have continuous presence in the Middle East or in Jerusalem, and therefore we have a right to Palestine. But who allowed and permitted this continuous presence of Jews in Jerusalem if it wasn't the Muslims from the time of Caliph Prophet Muhammad all the way down to the Ottomans and even now?
Yeah, and you'll never hear Zionists reminding us that the most horrific massacre of Jews in Palestine was conducted by the Crusaders once they seized control of Jerusalem, and blood was literally flowing through the streets. But you know, in the contemporary Zionist narrative, Israel is a Western European state. It minimizes the persecution of Jews in Europe. It has established now its main supporters are the European far right, the ideological inheritors of Nazism and neo-Nazism. And of course, it has to vilify and dehumanize Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims more broadly.
I think added to that, I think I want to ask you about one of the other claims that have been continuously made by the Israelis, which is that if you recognize a Palestinian state, as Norway and two other European countries did, their argument is that, of course, it's completely fallacious, that you are rewarding terrorism. What about rewarding someone committing genocide, which the Saudis and the so-called, well, through the Abraham Accords are doing? What does it mean for the international community when you reward someone committing a genocide in this manner? So yes, you can speak about rewarding terrorists. What about rewarding someone who's the ICC and the ICJ and the UN are saying is committing, more or less committing genocide? So what does that say? And what kind of world will we be in when you're rewarding someone complicit or
Well,
carrying out
and
genocide?
who's making this argument exactly?
The Israelis. The Israelis say you're
Is
rewarding.
it Israel that was established on the ashes of Palestine as a result on the Nakba? And who exactly is supporting them in this argument? The United States. This is the United States, which was established on the basis of a successful military campaign against Great Britain, of which the American colonies were a part. I mean, let's not be so naive as to think that every state that exists today was established on the basis of a weekend away at camp in which marshmallows were toasted on a fire. It certainly wasn't the case in Algeria or in Vietnam or in many of these other places. And in fairness, yes, were it not for the past 8 months, people would be completely ignoring the question of Palestine and let Israel have its way with them, as they have been doing for many years previously. But at the same time, you know, what Israel is basically saying is it doesn't matter that these people have internationally recognized inalienable rights. It doesn't matter that we're illegally occupying them and engaging in all kinds of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and now also genocide. You need to reward us and let us continue acting with total impunity rather than make any effort to actually bring the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to fruition. You're not even allowed to recognize the rights that exist.
I think on a related point, I mean, do you think the US has reached the limit of its desire or willingness to pressure Israel? Because there's no pretense of there being a red line anymore. We saw Israel enter Gaza and bomb Gaza, Rafah, 2,000 pound bombs on tents, and that's quite horrific and shocking. Even though the US over through many months said that Rafah was a red line. And it seems to me, every time the ICC or the UN intervene against Israel on behalf of Palestine, Washington and London automatically revert back to their, ironclad support for Israel. So they say one thing, and then as soon as one of the international institutions says something against Israel, they cannot help but return back to the status quo position of offering ironclad support. So I think the way I look at it is they've reached the limit of their capacity to be able to exert any kind of influence on Israel. Of course, it's just nothing but words, but I don't think there'll be any more from the Biden administration, certainly, because as I said, there's an election and there's an international growing campaign against Israel, and therefore it's very unlikely they can do anything more.
Yes, I would make 2 points. The first is it was actually made by Daniel Levy, the head of the U.S. Middle East Project, in a recent interview. And he pointed out that the U.S. position on this is that only Washington has a right to criticize Israel. Washington can set red lines for Israel. Washington can tell Israel what to do and what not to do. But God forbid anyone else, even the world's highest court, or the United Nations or any other organization, try to prescribe certain forms of behavior for Israel. Then the U.S. goes all out, condemning and seeking to minimize and dismiss those efforts, because again, Washington and Washington alone has the right to criticize Israel. Secondly, regarding this latest red line and all the previous U.S. statements about Israel's conduct, which are critical in one way or another, I think we've had enough examples, certainly over the last 8 months, arguably over the last 8 decades, that we can now definitively conclude that these statements are really made for one purpose and one purpose alone. They're in response to growing domestic and international pressure on the US government to do something. So it comes out with these purportedly bold statements like Rafah has a red line, we've suspended the delivery of 2,000-pound bombs and everything. And then those seize the headlines for a few days, and everyone begins congratulating Washington for finally putting its foot down and taking a firm line with Israel. And then, of course, absolutely nothing happens. The red line was basically a river of blood in a safe zone in Rafah, and I think we need to see such statements and such positions as really an exercise in smoke and mirrors, a diversionary charade. Statements that were intended to be meaningless from the very outset, and whose sole purpose is to absorb this growing public and international outrage at what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. I don't believe there was ever any intention to follow through on any of these statements. I think they were intended purely for public consumption by people who are fully on board with what Israel is doing, and really, at the end of the day, fundamentally have absolutely no problem with what Israel is doing, but are acting in this way merely to deflect a political problem that, as they see it, that Israel's conduct is creating for themselves, and they have found that this is the best formula to address and resolve this problem. But at the end of the day, they're fully on board. They have absolutely no problem with what Israel is doing. And why am I saying that? Well, look at what they're doing in terms of unprecedented weapons deliveries. Look at what they're doing in terms of diplomatic protection. Look at all the threats coming out of Washington against the International Criminal Court. These are not the Trumpists in the Senate. This is U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken telling the Senate that he is fully open to a bipartisan U.S. campaign to take retaliatory measures against the International Criminal Court. And I have to say this again. As far as Washington is concerned, certainly this administration, most certainly its president, its Secretary of State, its National Security Advisor, and its chief Middle East point man, for them, Palestinians are not human beings. Palestinians are irrelevant and expendable human scum. The less of them, the better.
And I think what you've said leads on to our final question for today's review, which is the pier which Biden promised to build. And again, the whole initiatives is really a demonstration of American weakness and its inability to exert influence on the Israelis. Everyone knows that the best way to deliver humanitarian assistance is via road, but instead of doing that, the US decided to build a pier. And now, I mean, it's quite ironic and I would say humorous. I mean, it's hard to find humor in the kind of situation we're in at the moment, but this is quite humorous. The fact waves have swept away vessels which are supporting the pier which Biden installed to transfer aid to Gaza. And to me, the way I look at it is it's almost like a perfect metaphor of US power and influence being washed away by the rise of global consciousness, the wave of global consciousness over Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. That's how I see the metaphor between the pier being washed away by the waves and what we're seeing happening to the US on a global stage. How do you, yeah.
Please go ahead.
No. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that before we finish.
Well, I think this ties directly into the issue we were just discussing. The entire purpose of this pier was to cover for Israel's medieval siege of the Gaza Strip. Israel closed all the land crossings. The US was perfectly fine with that. Again, the US desperately wants to achieve, the US desperately wants to see Israel achieve each and every one of its objectives in the Gaza Strip. The US's only problem with Israel is failure. It's not its conduct, it's Israel's failure to achieve its objectives against Hamas, against the civilian population of the Gaza Strip, and so on. This whole pier project was intended to divert attention from the Israeli siege of the Gaza Strip and to cover for it. It was an exercise in smoke and mirrors from the very outset. It was a diversionary charade from the very outset. It was never intended to provide urgently needed humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. It was meant to legitimize Israel's deprivation of prohibition on the entry of urgently needed humanitarian assistance in the Gaza Strip. And now we're supposed to believe that the US Navy is incapable of constructing a temporary pier without it being washed away by the first wave that that it encounters. I mean, look at what the US Navy is doing in the Red Sea to protect Israel and Israeli ships from Houthi missile attacks. Those ships aren't sinking. And I think what has happened to this pier shows the level of interest in U.S. interest in this whole issue. The pier has served its purpose. The pier gave Israel 2 additional months to starve to death the population of the Gaza Strip. So it can be washed away now. It's mission accomplished.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin.
Thank you very much, Nasim.
And thank you all for tuning in. See you next week for another review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and Mouin Rabbani, the weekly MEMO review show. Bye-bye.